questions?
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Quebecers have known for a long time now that this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. But the Bloc doesn't seem to understand that. The Bloc apparently wants to drastically increase taxes. And they even support differential and preferential application of the taxes. And we've heard in the media that there's been a guarantee that the Liberal Prime Minister will remain in power for another 2 years, so yet another costly coalition. What concessions did the Prime Minister make to the Bloc Quebecois in order to stay in power for another 2 years? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, our government was proud to follow in Quebec's footsteps when it comes to daycare. Our government is also very proud to follow in Quebec's footsteps when it comes to climate action. Quebec has led very well. Quebec was one of the first provinces to put a price on pollution. And we are very happy to work with all Quebecers for the environment. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Yes, but my question was for the Prime Minister, who is hiding and who is not worth the cost. My question is about the Bloc Quebecois' decision to vote in favour of home heating taxes. Today, though, we've learned that the Bloc's desire to drastically increase this Prime Minister's carbon taxes are not random. The Bloc Quebecois, in fact, has promised the Prime Minister that they will keep him in power in a 2-year costly coalition. What concessions did the Bloc get in order to keep this incompetent and costly Prime Minister in power? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, the Opposition Leader wants to talk about Quebec. Fine. The Opposition Leader wants to move Quebec backwards. They want to move Quebec backwards on basic rights, women's rights, climate change. They want to put firearms back in the streets in Quebec. The Conservative Leader, he wants to send Quebecers and Canadians back to the Stone Age. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The Prime Minister is in Ottawa today, so the question is for him. He is panicked now and put a pause on the carbon tax for 3% of Canadians in ridings where his polls are plummeting and his MPs are revolting. Also revolting were the comments of a Liberal Rural Affairs Minister who stated that other Canadians would have got a pause on the pain if they had elected more Liberals. Yet Northern Ontarians did elect Liberals. So the question for the Prime Minister, will he allow a free vote for his Northern MPs on our common sense motion to keep the heat on and take the tax off?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I have explained to the Leader of the Opposition through many different question periods over the past number of days, home heating oil is 2 to 4 times as expensive as natural gas. It accelerated by 75% in 2022. We have put into place a plan that will enable people to get off of heating oil, to have free heat pumps. It will save them up to $2,500 a year. It will make it more affordable, and at the same time, it will allow us to fight climate change. That is true for the 270,000 households that use heating oil here in Ontario.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The question was for the Prime Minister, who first was dividing and now is in hiding. He wants to quadruple his tax, but now he's had to back down and give a pause to the pain for 3% of people in ridings where his polls are plummeting and his MPs are in full revolt against him. His Liberal Minister of Rural Affairs said if people in other regions want the same pause on the pain, they have to elect Liberal MPs. However, many did. We have a Liberal MP in Calgary and one in Edmonton. Will they be allowed a free vote on the common sense Conservative motion to take the tax off and keep the heat on?
The Honourable Minister.
It's important to have thoughtful public policy prescriptions that address issues around affordability in a long-term way, but also actually address the issue of climate change. And I would say, Mr. Speaker, the only person who is hiding in this chamber is the Leader of the official opposition, who is hiding the fact that he either does not believe in climate change, or he certainly doesn't think it's very important. He has not spoken the words climate change since he was elected, and he has no plan. At some point, he needs to tell Canadians, what is your plan to address the climate crisis?
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I'm right here while the Prime Minister hides and divides. And why wouldn't he hide? After all, he's in panic mode. He first promised to quadruple the tax on everyone, and then after I beat him in that debate, he decided to back down and lift the tax off 3% of people for a short period of time. His Rural Affairs Minister said that if other Canadians wanted the same pause from the pain, they needed to elect more Liberals. Well, Thunder Bay elected 2 Liberals. It's a very cold place. Will the members for Thunder Bay be given a free vote on our motion to take the tax off and keep the heat on?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, let me tell you who is missing in action when it comes to protecting Canadians and their affordability. And I'm talking about the affordability of life for our seniors. You know who's missing in action? The Conservative leader. It took him 29 days to speak up for the Canada Pension Plan. But none of us should have been surprised, because last year he sought to eviscerate that plan, which is so important to every single Canadian, by seeking to freeze contributions. We can't trust Conservatives with our pensions or anything else.
The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, last week, TVA had to lay off 1/3 of its workforce. That's 547 Quebec television professionals out of work in one fell swoop. It's tragic. And if it's happening at TVA, it's bound to happen elsewhere. It's inevitable. We can't just turn a blind eye and claim that the new version of the Broadcasting Act and C-18 will solve the problem. They won't, not at all. So the question is simple. Are we going to watch television die little by little and not do anything about it? Or is the government prepared to rethink everything in order to save conventional TV? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, first, my thoughts go out to employees who have been affected by this layoff. And my thoughts are also with their families at the beginning of the holiday seasons. Unfortunately, in telecommunications and in journalism, there is a rapidly changing landscape since the advent of online streaming services and online platforms. We will work with all parties in this House to implement all solutions that we can, because our cultural industries are essential for our democracy and for our society. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for La Prairie. TV is the channel through which information is shared with the people, the channel through which our culture is shared. Television reminds us of who we are, what we can create, and what makes us unique. Something that the YouTubes, Netflixes, and Disneys of this world will never be able to do. Our television is made by us and for us, and it's truly in danger. As we watch our channels disappearing and turning off, we're waiting for Ottawa to turn them back on. But it's urgent. What will it take for the government to wake up? The Honourable Heritage Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I share my colleagues' concerns. That's why in 2020, we introduced for the first time an act to modernize the Broadcasting Act. But unfortunately, the Conservatives have been blocking it and blocking it. They have tried to block us from trying to modernize our audiovisual universe and our media landscape. Today, the Conservatives claim that we're trying to censure Canadians, But what we truly want is quality journalism everywhere in the country. We want a thriving cultural industry and creative industry that's essential for democracy and for all of society. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Vancouver East.
For 3 decades, Liberals and Conservatives relied on the private market, and now the average rent for 1 bedroom is $2,500 a month. The government's own housing advocate is calling for more community housing that fit people's budgets. And the Bank of Canada says investing in social housing wouldn't be inflationary. The Conservative leader is calling investment in social housing a Soviet-style takeover. He's in it for wealthy investors. The Liberals are failing Canadians. Will the Prime Minister stop siding with Conservatives and commit to doubling Canada's social housing stock?
The honourable Minister for Housing.
Mr. Speaker, I agree wholeheartedly with my colleague about the Conservative leader's rhetoric around Soviet-style housing to describe cooperatives. It mirrors the same approach he took over the course of the summer when he labelled a Niagara Woman's home a shack. Dismissing the living quarters of ordinary Canadians is entirely inappropriate. I further agree with the NDP member that we need to continue to make the kinds of investments that will build more social housing for low-income families. We got back into this game, into the National Housing Strategy after 30 years of absence. We're going to continue to build more homes so everyone can afford a roof over their head.
The honourable member from Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, people in Newfoundland and Labrador could certainly use some help when it comes to their costs. 77% are saying that they're living paycheck to paycheck. But what we continue to get are answers that are not a commitment to doubling that social housing stock or to recapitalize funds that the government's already created to build social housing, even when it doesn't cost them money. They won't lift a finger. We stood by as we watched the Competition Bureau fight tooth and nail against the Rogers-Shaw merger. The government turned around and approved it. Now they have a chance to support our initiative to strengthen the Competition Act. Will they do it?
The honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for his question. In fact, Mr. Speaker, him and member of this House will have an opportunity to do something for Canadians. I've asked the Leader of the Opposition to do one thing for Canadians, not something he does very often, but one thing, was to vote for C-56, Mr. Speaker, because in C-56, Canadians will be happy to learn that at home, but we're going to reform competition, Mr. Speaker. We're going to give more power to the Competition Commissioner. We're going to remove these mergers that are harmful to competition, and we're going to remove these clauses that are hurting competition. We want more competition, lower prices in this country, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The NDP voted 16 times in favour of the carbon tax. Its leader has supported quadrupling the tax on the home heating of every single Canadian. But after working-class union households have been abandoning his party for the Conservatives in droves, he has now flip-flopped. But that has involved the courage of admitting he was wrong. Will the Prime Minister show the same courage and admit he, just like the NDP leader, is dead wrong and vote for our common sense motion to keep the heat on and take the tax off?
The honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I find it helpful when you deal with people who are closest to the problem. And in Atlantic, Canada, we have an Ecology Action Centre based in Halifax who wrote a statement that I think was prescient to the debate that's going on here. It says, energy poverty and climate change represent a direct threat to working class people in Nova Scotia. As a society, we must work together to ensure households with low incomes can transition away from expensive fossil fuels to technologies like heat pumps that are cheaper, better for our health, and afford us the comforts associated with heating and cooling. Policy makers are finally rising to meet the challenge, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Regina Capel.
After 8 years, the Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. Now he wants to quadruple the tax on home heating, gas, and groceries. But he decided to pause the pain for just 3% of families in areas where he's plummeting in the polls and his MPs are revolting. The Liberal Rural Affairs Minister said that if people on the prairies wanted a break from the carbon tax exemption, they should have elected more Liberal MPs. Well, the people in Sudbury did elect a Liberal. I visited there last week, and people there there want to know why their MP has been unable to get them a pause on the pain. So simple question for the Prime Minister. Will he allow a free vote for the member for Sudbury on our motion to take the tax off and keep the heat on?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's important for Canadians that people are serious in terms of bringing forward policy prescriptions, not simply taglines. We have put into place measures that will address a critical affordability issue. Home heating oil is 2 to 4 times as expensive as natural gas. It went up 75% during 2022. There is an opportunity to be able to reduce the energy cost for people on an ongoing basis, all the while addressing the issue of climate change, something that the Leader of the Opposition clearly does not believe in. It is something that is important for Canada. It's important for the 270,000 Ontario homes that currently heat with heating oil.
Excellent.
The Honourable Member from Regina Capel.
Are in complete carbon tax chaos over there, Mr. Speaker. Their pause on the pain doesn't apply to 97% of Canadians, and it punishes those who use cleaner Canadian natural gas and propane to heat their homes. What did the Liberal Rural Affairs Minister have to say? She said, well, if people in other areas want the pause too, they should elect Liberals. Well, the people in North Bay did elect a Liberal MP. So again, to the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, will he allow a free vote so that the members from North Bay can vote on our motion to take the tax off and keep the heat on?
The Honourable Member is a veteran member of this House, and he knows that all questions, I will remind all members that all questions are directed through the Chair. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as I said last week, it would be great if in this House we could have debates about how we fight climate change, not whether we fight climate change, because in 2023 it's really not an option. It's an existential threat, and we're living in a climate emergency. And Canadians know how important it is to fight climate change, and they know that on this point the Conservatives have absolutely no plan. When you don't have a plan for the environment, you don't have a plan for the economy, Mr. Speaker, those Conservatives continue to be risky and irresponsible, and they're certainly not worth that risk.
The Honourable Member from Thornhill.
Years of this Liberal NDP government, the Prime Minister's carbon tax is making it impossible for Canadians to heat their homes this winter. That's especially true right here in soon-to-be frigid Ottawa. There are 12 Liberal MPs here, a cabinet minister, 3 privy councillors, 4 parliamentary secretaries, but according to the minister from Newfoundland, all of these MPs weren't effective enough to get their communities a pause on the pain of the carbon tax. Will they make things right and stand with us today and axe the tax, or will they vote again with the Prime Minister and leave Ottawa residents in the cold?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you know, there was a time when Canadian progressive Conservative voters could rely on members of that Conservative caucus for leadership on fighting climate change. In fact, the member from Wellington Halton Hills staked his entire Conservative leadership campaign on it. What he said exactly, and I quote, is, "The right way to do it is to price carbon through a revenue-neutral carbon tax." He staked his entire Conservative leadership campaign on that. Sadly, he lost. But you know, Mr. Speaker, I agree with him when he said we don't have a plan to fight climate change and reduce emissions, then we won't win the next election. That was true in 2019, that was true in 2021, and it's true today.
The Honourable Member from Thornhill.
If the Prime Minister can pause the pain for some Canadians, then surely he can do it for all Canadians. These Liberal MPs should be demanding that. Yep. But they are missing in action. Like the MIA Liberals from the GTA, like that member. Their communities want relief from this costly coalition, but they've been hiding for a week, so I'll give them the chance to show up now. Will the Prime Minister allow the members whose phone number starts with 905 a free vote to take the tax off so their communities can keep the heat on?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what my honourable colleagues continue to forget is that this policy does apply right across the country.
That's
so
right.
whether you are in the GTA, whether you are in Northern Ontario, whether you are in Saskatchewan or Manitoba or anywhere else in this country, the price on pollution has been removed for those that use home heating oil, Mr. Speaker. It would be good if the Conservatives actually focused on the facts and allowed us to debate climate change and how we're going to fight it, not if climate change is real or not. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Good answer.
The honourable member from Kenora.
The Prime Minister is planning to quadruple the tax on heat, gas, and groceries, but he decided to pause the pain for 3% of families in areas where he's plummeting in the polls and where his MPs are revolting. The Liberal Rural Affairs Minister has said if others wanted the pause, then they should have voted Liberal. But people in Nickel Belt voted for a Liberal MP, Mr. Speaker, yet they are not seeing a pause in this tax. So will the Prime Minister today allow the member from Nickel Belt a free vote to vote with us to take the tax off and keep the heat on for people in Northern Ontario and right across the country?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I am so proud to be a Northern Liberal Member of Parliament because what I do every day, Mr. Speaker, is I work with constituents who are telling me we need to take faster action on the climate because we are losing acres of forest, Mr. Speaker, because we are seeing droughts, yes, even in Northern Ontario, Mr. Speaker, making it harder to grow food, making it harder to grow our economy. My constituents expect me to advocate for a clean environment, and that's exactly what I'll do.
The honourable member for Montarville. Mr. Speaker, let's talk about immigration targets. Allow me to cite a document. Starting in 2026, set the annual immigration target at some 500,000 immigrants if the population reaches 40 million as planned. You might think that I'm quoting the plan that the Liberals announced last week. But no, I'm quoting McKinsey's Century Initiative. The capping of targets announced for 2026 has literally been McKinsey's plan all along. When is the federal government going to adjust the targets based on our integration capacity instead of blindly following the advice of McKinsey, which is a private company that literally manages immigration in Canada? The Honourable Immigration Minister. Mr. Speaker, I think that's an odd comment. The Bloc is so out of left field. They're so far out in the field that they should go out into the fields and see agriculture workers and see if they need some help. Quebec needs temporary foreign workers. We are working with Quebec, and the Bloc should understand that. The honourable member for Montarville. Mr. Speaker, not only is Ottawa following McKinsey, Ottawa is following them blindly. McKinsey themselves confirmed that their immigration targets do not take integration capacity into account. Former CEO Dominic Barton said in committee last year, the focus was solely on the economy. We were not thinking about the social context. We were thinking about productivity. Mr. Speaker, capping immigration targets at 500,000 means applying advice that does not take into account our integration capacity. But the government, last week, promised to respect our integration capacity. So will the government review its targets? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I never talked to McKinsey. I talked to Canadians who want more foreign workers. They want more immigrants to come and work in factories and in the fields. 500,000 is a reasonable target. It's a target 3 years down the line, and it has nothing to do with McKinsey's advice. The honourable member for Montarville. Mr. Speaker, the only difference between Ottawa and McKinsey is that Ottawa is going faster. McKinsey predicted that the population would hit 40 million by 2026. We reached that mark in June. According to Stats Canada, if the 2022 and 2023 trend continues, the population will double in just 25 years. The population will exceed 80 million by 2048, regardless of our integration capacity for housing, health, education, French language training, and the list goes on. Mr. Speaker, when will this government finally understand that successful immigration means respecting our integration capacity? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, Over the past year, Canadians have asked us to do more when it comes to integration capacity. But what people have also told me is that we need immigration to help our businesses grow. There is still a labor shortage. The approach that we need to prioritize is to be more strategic with our targets. We tabled new strategic targets just recently, and the Bloc should be comforted by that if they like immigration, and if they don't, then let them say so.
From Parry Sound, Muskoka.
The Prime Minister plans to quadruple the carbon tax on heat, gas, and groceries. Now, he decided to pause the pain for 3% of families where his poll numbers were plummeting and his MPs were revolting. The Liberal World Affairs Minister said if people in the prairies wanted a carbon tax break, they should elect Liberals. Well, the people in Sault Ste. Marie, Mr. Speaker, did elect a Liberal MP, and yet the majority of his constituents are not getting the break. Will the Prime Minister allow the MP from Sault Ste. Marie to freely vote to take the tax off and keep the heat on for the people of the Sioux?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Conservative Party, as is often the case, is leaving out many important facts. 8 out of 10 Canadian families actually get more money back in the rebate than they pay in the price on pollution. It is an important part of having a robust plan to address climate change in a thoughtful way. With respect to home heating, it is a particular issue that we can invest in to ensure that we are actually saving money for people as we move forward while continuing to address climate change. The Conservative Party is hiding. They are hiding from science. They are hiding from evidence. They need to have a plan to fight climate change. Canadians expect more.
The Honourable Member from Stormont Dundas, South Glengarry.
Canadians are watching for today's vote on our common sense Conservative motion to take the tax off all forms of home heating for all Canadians. The Liberal Rural Affairs Minister said, though, that if people want a pause on the tax, they should have elected more Liberals in their region. But Thunder Bay did elect 2 Liberal MPs, and yet folks there aren't getting any pause. Instead, the Prime Minister plans to quadruple the tax on heat, gas, and groceries rather than treating them fairly. So the question is, will the Prime Minister allow these 2 Liberal MPs from Thunder Bay to vote freely to take the tax off so people can keep the heat on?
The Honourable House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, the Conservatives continue to spread information in this chamber. This pause on the price on pollution on home heating oil applies right across the country, despite what the Conservatives keep saying. But what is particularly concerning, and I think I speak on behalf of every Ontario Member of Parliament and many Ontario residents, is every time they say common sense, it brings up the terrible memories of the Mike Harris years when not only did they slash public services, but they slashed them in such incredible ways that led to things like Walkerton. Mr. Speaker, Ontarians remember, and they're not going to elect common sense Conservatives again. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from South Dundas, Stormont Dundas, South Glengarry.
Here's just how out of touch and tone deaf the Liberals are. When asked if she'd support giving the same pause on home heating back home, their own minister right from Thunder Bay said, quote, "We don't have the same challenges in Northern Ontario that we see in Atlantic Canada," unquote. Well, I visited Thunder Bay last week, and let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, it gets very cold there too, just like Atlantic Canada. And after 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, the cost of living crisis there is so bad, the regional food bank can't keep up with surging demand, now at 12,000 people. Will the Prime Minister let his Thunder Bay MPs vote to give residents fair treatment, take the tax off, they can keep the heat on?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative Provincial Finance Minister of Ontario knows that pensions matter for the people of Ontario. That's why he wrote me a letter asking me to convene a meeting of all the provincial finance ministers to defend our pensions. Will the Conservative MPs from Ontario be equally courageous and responsible in defending the pensions of the people of Ontario and support our effort to keep the pensions of all Canadians safe?
I'm going to ask all members, please, especially the member from Battle Creek, Battle River Crowfoot, to please listen to the responses which are offered and to take the floor. And I'd ask all members to listen to that member when that member does take the floor. The honourable member from London Fanshawe.
Palestinian Canadians in my riding did everything possible to work with Global Affairs Canada to get their loved ones out of Gaza. They put all of their hopes on Sunday's evacuation, only to hear nothing from Canadian officials. The bombardments are getting more intense. My constituents, their families, Canadian citizens are trapped. They need this government to stand for human rights and to protect lives. The heads of 18 UN agencies and NGOs and my constituents are calling for a ceasefire. Why can't the Prime Minister?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Speaker. The situation in Gaza is dire, and many Canadians are worried about their loved ones. What is happening on the ground is fluid and unpredictable, and we know there are delays at the Rafah crossing for all countries. I want to reassure Canadians that we are in regular contact with Egypt and Israel to push for Canadians to leave as soon as possible. We continually try to reach all Canadians, permanent residents, and their immediate family members to convey the latest information. Mr. Speaker, that's why we continue to call for humanitarian pauses for Canadians to get out, for aid to get in, and for all hostages to be released. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Windsor West.
Mr. Speaker, 18 United Nations agencies and international NGOs, including UNICEF and Save the Children, called for an immediate ceasefire in Israel-Palestine, expressing shock and horror at the mounting death toll from the conflict, saying it's a graveyard for children. It's been 30 days. Enough is enough. The UN and the NGO heads sent in a rare joint statement. This must stop now. When will this government finally do what most of the world has called for, and that's an immediate ceasefire to save the children right now?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We unequivocally condemn the Hamas terrorist attack. The price of justice cannot be the continued suffering of all Palestinian civilians. What is unfolding in Gaza is a human tragedy. The Minister of Foreign Affairs has been to the region twice to oversee our efforts to help Canadians, but also to de-escalate the situation. That's why we continue to call for international humanitarian law to be upheld and for humanitarian pauses so that Canadians can leave, humanitarian aid can get in, and all hostages are released. Canada is committed to a goal of a just and lasting peace in the Middle East.
The honourable member from Yukon.
Mr. Speaker, we know that many Canadian families are struggling to make ends meet, and this is particularly the case in the Yukon, where more than half of families spend over 30% of their income on housing. The Minister of National Revenue recently made an important announcement alongside Ms. Tracy Ann McPhee, Yukon Minister of Health and Social Services. Can the Minister of National Revenue inform the House of this announcement and how it will affect our Yukon families?
Bravo.
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to announce that Yukon families can now apply for the Canada Child Benefit when registering for the birth of their newborn through the automated benefits application service of Yukon Vital Statistics Office. It's the quickest and easiest way to apply for and receive the benefit. It's more than $5,500 on average per year for Yukon families. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. After 8 years of this Liberal government, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost, and they want to stay in power for the next 2 years. The Liberal Bloc Coalition will vote against our motion to eliminate or pause the carbon tax on all forms of heating. Yes, it's expensive to vote for the Bloc as well. Does it not bother the Bloc to vote the Liberals for the next 2 years? What promise did the Prime Minister make for the unconditional support of the Bloc? The Honourable Minister. We seem to have
found ourselves in a time machine here. They wanted to make a step back in terms of the rights of women and take steps back in terms of climate change and the fight against it. They're not even able to describe climate change. They want to bring us back to the Stone Age. The honourable member for Mégantic-l'Érable. We're looking at a government from the Stone Age. We are going to vote on a motion that will require the government to pause all carbon tax on home heating for all Canadians. The Bloc has chosen its camp. They want to radically increase the carbon tax, and it's imposed. It's in favor of a 20% extra tax to each litre of gas. It's expensive to vote Bloc. What did the Prime Minister promise its partner, the Bloc, to raise taxes on the backs of all Quebecers? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, for a rare time, I agree with my colleague. We are going to have a government from the Stone Age. We're taking a step back on fundamental rights in terms of arms control, a step back in terms of the fight against climate change. He has clearly said this. We're going back to the Stone Age, Mr. Speaker. This is incredible. We'll never take a step back. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, after eight years of this Liberal government, who would have believed it? The Bloc is now behind supporting the Liberal government morally. They seem to be getting along quite well because their position in terms of heating divided Canadians. But that's exactly what the Bloc wants to do, divide and create problems. The Bloc wants to radically increase carbon tax. It will inspire them. My question is that will members be able to vote for common sense? I think all members would like colleagues, order. I think all colleagues would like to hear the answer from the Honourable Minister. The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, my colleague was the last person to speak at the National Assembly before the adoption of the carbon market. It was adopted via unanimous consent. If he didn't like it then, why didn't he raise his voice then and speak against it? Why did he change his position today? Because he didn't speak out against unanimity at the time. What has changed for my colleague over the past few years? He wants to go back to the Stone Age, and we won't go there, Mr. Speaker. Order. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, another thing means that the Bloc is really buddy-buddy with the Liberal Party. The Parti Québécois budget, it talks about the poor management of the Liberal government is now an argument in favor of independence. No, we're not going back to the Trudeau Stone Age, that's for sure. Will the Bloc's members be able to speak up and make sure that all of their members will be able to vote for common sense? Order. The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're seeing once again that every time a Conservative member rises, there's something hiding. They're not able to say the truth. They're not able to take responsibility for what they did in the past. It's really rare when you have a Quebec colleague. Well, when they supported the carbon market, they should have been proud of what happened in Quebec and proud to be able to protect the environment across Canada. The Honourable Member for Rivière-du-Nord. Mr. Speaker, more than 221,000 SMEs are at risk of bankruptcy if the federal government does not defer repayment of CEBA loans without the loss of the subsidy. We're not talking about billionaire multinational companies. We're talking about small businesses that contribute to the vitality of our regions. Here in Rivière-du-Nord, 213 SMEs have alerted the Quebec Federation of Independent Businesses that bankruptcy is looming. Mr. Speaker, when will the minister finally offer businesses the postponement they're asking for and avoid a wave of bankruptcies on her conscience? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, we've already granted small businesses 1 additional year to refund part of the CEBA loan. When they asked for more assistance, we offered greater flexibility in terms of refinancing and more time, and a 1-year prolongation of the deadline for the refund. Unlike the Conservatives, that will bring us back to the Stone Age. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Order. The Honourable Member for Trois-Rivières. Mr. Speaker, it's even worse in Trois-Rivières. 288 SMEs have said that they'll go bankrupt if the federal government doesn't postpone repayment of CEBA loans for 1 year with no loss of the subsidies. 288 business bankruptcies. Imagine the number of job losses that this would represent. The minister cannot condone this by her inaction. Does she know how many bankruptcies are likely to occur in her region? How can she justify to these entrepreneurs that she's going to turn their back on them rather than offer them a 1-year postponement as they've requested? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we are proud of having created a program that provided $49 billion in support to our SMEs across the country. And what's important today is that small businesses have until December 31st, 2026 to refund their CEBA loan in full. We are here for our small businesses in Quebec and across Canada at these essential times. The Honourable Member for Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord. Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this Liberal government, food banks are overflowing, groceries cost more, and now today the Bloc is supporting the Liberals to maintain the carbon tax on the back of Quebecers. Mr. Speaker, it costs expensive to vote for the Bloc. It's expensive. Are the Liberals forming new coalition with the Bloc to increase taxes on the backs of Quebecers? Order.
Order. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, I have to explain this once again. There is no carbon price in Quebec, a tax rather. Canadians are concerned by climate change, and we need a plan, Mr. Speaker. Those Conservatives, Mr. Speaker, are not worth the risk. And that is why we created a system. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from St. Albert, Edmonton.
Speaker, after 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, Alberta got shafted yet again. With Liberal support collapsing in Atlantic Canada, this desperate Prime Minister gave Atlantic Canadians a pause on his punitive carbon tax on home heating, while Albertans got nothing. Today, the Liberal minister from Edmonton Centre has a choice. Will he support our common sense Conservative motion to axe the tax on home heating, or will he once again sell out his constituents to his boss, the Prime Minister?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Honourable Member for his question, and he knows well that we have billions of dollars in Budget 23 for carbon capture, use and storage. We have green and clean electricity regulations and money that will benefit Alberta. But Mr. Speaker, that member doesn't want people to know that he's one of the CPC Silent 30 who have not come to the aid of Albertans. He is not defending the Canada Pension Plan. He doesn't care that the Conservative government of Alberta are scaring pensioners. He's silent. We're going to protect pensions. That's our job, and we're going to do it every day.
Get your resume out.
The honourable member from Calgary Forest Lawn.
Mr. plans on quadrupling the tax on gas, groceries, and home heating. He gave 3% of Canadians a pause on the carbon tax for home heating, where his poll numbers were tanking and his MPs were revolting. The Liberal Rural Affairs Minister said if people on the prairies want a pause on the tax, they should elect more Liberals. Well, the MP of Calgary Skyview is a Liberal, but his constituents don't get the pause. Will the Prime Minister let that member mail in a free vote on our common sense Conservative motion to take the tax off and keep the heat on, and shove this carbon tax where the Prime Minister's poll numbers are, in the gutter?
The Honourable Minister.
Speaker, another silent Conservative on the issue of pensions in Alberta. What a shame to be a Calgary Conservative. But Mr. Speaker, let's talk about Conservative priorities coming out of Alberta. Instead of building housing, instead of growing our economy, instead of actually doing the work of Albertans, what does the UCP AGM, what are their priorities, Mr. Speaker? Turning back protections for LGBTQ2 people, taking our province back. Mr. Speaker, they're actually voted in favor of conspiracy theories when it comes to voting machines and 15-minute cities. They're out of touch, and they are reckless and not worth the cost.
I ask all members to please listen to their whips in terms of having more order in this House so that we can hear not only the questions but the answers.
The Honourable Member for Dorval-Lachine-LaSalle. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am very proud of our national content creators, whether in Quebec or elsewhere in Canada. Last week, Montrealers once again welcomed people from all over the world to Cinemania, a festival that has enjoyed nearly 3 decades of success and showcased some of the most incredible Francophone voices and creations that Canada has to share. Can the Minister tell us more about the important international agreement that was signed last Friday? The Honourable Minister of Canadian Heritage. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleague is absolutely right. Canada last week welcomed for the first time in Canada the President of Switzerland, and my colleague, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, signed a co-protection audiovisual agreement to increase the number of films and projects with higher budgets. So it's an excellent piece of news for our creators in Canada. This was international efforts. We're going to continue to support our audiovisual producers because we know how important they are in Canada.
From Portage-Lisgar.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister plans to quadruple the tax on heat, gas, and groceries. But now he's decided to pause the pain for just 3% of families in areas where he's plummeting in the polls. The Liberal Rural Affairs Minister said if people on the prairies wanted a pause on the tax, they should have elected more Liberals. But the people in St. Boniface, St. Vital did elect a Liberal MP, and yet his constituents aren't getting the pause. So the question is, will the Prime Minister allow the MP for St. Boniface, St. Vital to freely vote to take the tax off, keep the heat on for his constituents?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member is talking about a national program that is to get rid of polluting, expensive home heating oil and to transition those homes with free heat pumps into those homes. Mr. Speaker, this national program is applicable across Canada. It's applicable in Manitoba, where are thousands of people who use home heating oil. It's great for the environment. It's great for affordability. I plan to support this.
Hear, hear.
The honourable member from Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboia, Headingley.
The Prime Minister plans to quadruple the tax on heat, gas, and groceries. But then he decided to pause the pain for 3% of families in areas where he was plummeting in the polls and his MPs were revolting. The Liberal Rural Affairs Minister actually said if people on the prairies wanted a pause on the tax, they should have elected more Liberals. But here's the thing, the people of Winnipeg South Centre did elect a Liberal MP, and yet his constituents are not getting the pause. Will the Prime Minister allow that MP from Winnipeg South Centre a free vote to take the tax off and keep the heat on for people in his community?
Once again, I'd like to encourage all members, colleagues, all members to please hold your comments back to the time that you have the floor to ask a question or to give an answer. That way we can hear everything that's going on from all ends of the House. The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's time for that member to stop spreading misinformation. This is a national program, Mr. Speaker, a national program that aims to transition expensive, environmentally damaging home heating oil into free heating pumps, Mr. Speaker. This is a national policy that's applicable across Canada. There are thousands of homes in Manitoba who are eligible for the program. This is great for the environment. This is great for affordability.
Hear, hear.
The honourable member from Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
Mr. Speaker, every day the member from Winnipeg North gets up into this place and talks and talks and talks and says absolutely nothing. Says absolutely nothing.
Once again, before I return to colleagues, before I return to the member from Selkirk Interlake Eastman, I'm going to ask all colleagues once again to please, when you have the floor, use it. When you don't have the floor, listen to the person who does. The honourable member from 25. Honourable member, excuse me. I know the honourable member is anxious. I'd like to give the honourable member the opportunity to start his question from the top, please.
Well, Mr. Speaker, every day the member from North Winnipeg gets up here and all he does is talk, talk, and talk. Only the Liberals like it because he says absolutely nothing. Now, according to the Rural Affairs Minister, the member from Winnipeg North failed to stand up and fight for Manitobans. Because of him, Manitobans have been left out in the cold. They can't afford to heat and eat after 8 miserable years of this Prime Minister and his punitive carbon tax. Manitobans at this useless Liberal MPs are not worth the cost. Will the Prime Minister allow the member for
I would have liked to have heard the honourable member's end of question. Unfortunately, the honourable member's time had expired, and then some. This is the reason why it's important for both sides of the House to please allow the member to ask a question without interrupting, so that we can hear the question and the member can profit from the full time that the member would be entitled to. Is the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member wants to hear more from me. I'm happy to. Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, I want to remind
remind members across the way, an issue with the Conservative Party. Remember, I always say they're like a fish on a dock, flip-flopping all over the place, Mr. Speaker? That applies on the carbon price, too. I'll tell you what the leader of the Conservative Party doesn't tell Canadians. He's going to take away the rebate, Mr. Speaker. That's going to take out of the pockets 80% of the constituents of Winnipeg North, the people I represent, money out of their pocket. Shame on the leader for the official opposition for being so reckless and risky, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Calgary Skyview.
Mr. Speaker, I join Canadians across the country in giving a warm welcome and congratulations to our newest Supreme Court Justice, Mary T. Moreau. Justice Moreau was selected by the Independent Advisory Council, nominated by the Prime Minister, and will be sworn into her new position today. Justice Moreau is a fellow Western Canadian from Alberta who will serve Canadians well in this important role. Can the Minister of Justice and Attorney General inform this House on what makes Justice Moreau the right fit for our Supreme Court, and how will her appointment enhance our country's legal system?
The Honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General for Canada.
Thank you to the member from Calgary Skyview for that important question. Justice Moreau is a proud Franco-Albertan and previous Chief Justice of the Court of King's Bench of Alberta. She has a wealth of experience as a trial lawyer, as well as nearly 30 years of experience as a judge. She is a talented legal mind, an outstanding jurist, Mr. Speaker, and an expert in criminal law. And her appointment is a milestone for our country. With Justice Moreau, the judges on Canada's Supreme Court are now represented by a majority of women for the first time in Canadian history.
The honourable member from North Island, Powell River.
Mr. Speaker, women veterans will be attending commemoration services this week. Many of them will be asked if the medals they are wearing belong to their husband or their son or their father. Too often they feel invisible and diminished when they should feel acknowledged and respected for their service. This must change. Will the minister commit today to ensuring the participation of women veterans in Remembrance Day commemoration this year?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I think it's our government's commitment, and I can surely assure you on behalf of the Minister of Veterans Affairs and Associate Minister of Defence that women will always participate in Remembrance Day ceremonies, and their participation is a must. Thank you.
The honourable member from Spadina, Fort York.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians are witnessing the glorification of terrorism and incitement of hatred against the Jewish community at pro-Hamas terror rallies across our country. At a Queen's Park rally in Toronto, genocidal slogans called for violent acts against innocent civilians. B'nai B'rith have reported these rallies that support a listed terrorist organization. Mr. Speaker, why has the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada been silent on such grotesque displays of anti-Semitism and incitement? Has he asked his provincial and territorial counterparts to enforce Canada's hate propaganda laws? Mr. Speaker, Canadians believe in the rule of law, not mob rule.
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, far from being silent, our government has condemned all incitements to violence, all expressions of hate. Regularly, I talk to federal law enforcement authorities, the RCMP, CSIS, to understand what they're doing with provincial, territorial partners, municipal partners, to keep all communities safe. And Mr. Speaker, today I announced enhancements to the security infrastructure program to help all communities that are understandably concerned for their safety better prepare and discourage any potential act of violence. We're there to keep all communities safe, Mr. Speaker, and we'll continue to do that important work that all Canadians expect of us.
And with that comes the end of question period. I see rising on a point of order is the honourable member from Battle River, Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as you said in your statement a number of weeks ago, a well-placed heckle is certainly within the context of what decorum is in this place. However, what it was not said during that time is the ability for members to be able to take photographs. Now, the member from Kingston in the Islands during a previous state visit, quite notably, was recording what was taking place in this House. But, Mr. Speaker, what was found today is that at the time of 2:36 and 18 seconds today, the member from Etobicoke Centre, while on camera, shown up on CPAC and Parleview for all to see, appeared to be filming the proceedings of this place, while the member from Milton was not answering a question but responding to a question, Mr. Speaker. I would ask that you take a look at the video and that member apologize for so willfully disregarding the order and decorum that we expect all in this place to ensure that we can take our debate seriously here. Hey, hey!
Rising on point of order, I believe, is a member of Parliament from Kingston and the Islands. On the same point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to confirm that at no time when the mace is on the table have I ever taken a video in this House. I am fully aware of the rules.
The honourable member from Elmwood Transcona is also rising on the same point of order.
I am, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. I just want to point you to a ruling, and you'll forgive me because I'm spontaneously on my feet. I don't remember the date, but I do recall the member from Carleton having done a very similar thing, taking a recording as he was leaving the House of Commons. So I would exhort you to take a look at that incident and the ruling that followed it for guidance in this case. Thank you.
The honourable member from Etobicoke Centre rising on the same point of order.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is a special day for me because my father was in the gallery for the first time watching question period, and I attempted to take a photo of him in the gallery. To the extent that I broke the rules, I apologize for that to all members of this House.
I thank colleagues. First, I'd like to thank the member from Battle River Crowfoot for raising this point of order, and I also have heard the point of order from other members who rose on the same issue. I'd like to thank the honourable member from Etobicoke Centre for rising in this House to apologize. This is a good opportunity for me to remind all members that while the House is in session, that we are not to use our devices for phone calls or for recording in this House. It is important for all of us to do this so that we could freely exercise our roles as members of Parliament. As we know, we have very clear rules in terms of the use of how the cameras are used in this place, the cameras which are provided by CPAC. And this is a reason why, with, yes, the advent of these new technologies, we have to be very mindful of this. So I thank all members for that. I see the Honourable House Whip for the official opposition rising. Is this on the same point of order? Yes. Go ahead.
With respect, Mr. Speaker, it isn't enough for the member to just apologize. He must delete what it is that he recorded because it is against the standing rules.
I thank the Honourable Whip for the official opposition on this point. I take it as, and I'm certain all members who are listening carefully to the chair will take it upon themselves to act honourably. I think what the honourable member has raised is an important issue, and I would trust that when the member had presented his apology, he'll also take corrective action to that effect. It being 3:22 p.m., the House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the motion of Mr. Poilievre relating to the business of supply. Call in the members. Thank you. The question is as follows. Mr.
Poilievre, seconded by Mr. Shipley, moved that given that the government has announced a temporary 3-year pause to the federal carbon tax on home heating oil, the House call on the government to extend that pause to all forms of home heating.
The
10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favour of the motion will please rise.
Mr. Poilievre.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mr. Dentel.
Mr. Deltel.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mr. Paulus.
Monsieur Paulus.
Mr. Scheer.
Mr. Scheer.
Mr. Upal.
Mr. Upal.
Ms. Landsman.
Ms. Landsman.
Mr. Halland.
Mr. Lamb.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Mr. Barrett.
Mr. Barrett.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Duncan Stormont Dundas, South Glengarry.
Mr. Duncan Stormont Dundas, South Glengarry.
Mr. Beltud.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Ms. Finley.
Ms. Finley.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Abu Tayyif.
Mr. Abu Tayyif.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Ms. Ferrari.
Ms. Ferrari.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Stewart. Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Aitchison.
Mr. Aitchison.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Malello. Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Chambers.
Mr. Chambers.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Laub.
Mr. Law.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redekop.
Mr. Redekop.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Calkins.
Mr. Calkins.
Ms. Rude.
Ms. Rude.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Mr. Genereux.
Monsieur Genereux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Mazier.
Ms. Falk Battleford Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk Battleford Lloydminster.
Mr. Martel.
Monsieur Martel.
Mr. Gould.
Monsieur Gould.
Mr. Kirk.
Mr. Kirk.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Ms. Rempel Garner.
Ms. Rempel Garner.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Ellison.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. D'Entremont.
Mr. D'Entremont.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Lake.
Mr.
Lake.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Canna.
Mr. Canna.
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Cannings.
Ms. Barron.
Ms. Barron.
Ms. Zarillo.
Ms. Zarillo.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. McPherson.
Ms. McPherson.
Mr. Blakey.
Mr. Blakey.
Mr. Vong.
Mr. Vong.
Que tous ceux qui s'opposent à la
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Ms. Gould.
Mr. Blair.
Mr. Blair.
Mr. O'Regan.
Mr. O'Regan.
Ms. Ing.
Ms. Ing.
Mr. Champagne.
Monsieur Champagne.
Ms. Anand.
Ms. Anand.
Mr. Fraser.
Mr. Fraser.
Mr. Boissonneau.
Monsieur Boissonneau.
Mr. Varani.
Mr. Varani.
Ms. Sachs.
Ms. Sachs.
Ms. Suds.
Ms. Suds.
Ms. Bennett.
Ms. Bennett.
Ms. Chagger.
Ms. Chager.
Mr. McKay.
Mr. McKay.
Ms. Scrow.
Ms. Scrow.
Mr. McGinty.
Mr. McGinty.
Mr. Scarpaleggia.
Mr. Scarpaleggia.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Ms. Cara.
Ms. Cara.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Ms. Haidu.
Ms. Haidu.
Mr. McKinnon-Gatineau.
Monsieur McKinnon-Gatineau.
Ms. Jasek.
Ms. Jazek.
Madame Fortier.
Madame Fortier.
Madame Lalonde.
Madame Lalonde.
Mr. Garretson.
Mr. Garretson.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Madame Bendayen.
Madame Bendayen.
Mr. Fragiscatos.
Mr. Fergascatos.
Mr. Bittel.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Bruson.
Mr. Bruson.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Ms. Dillon.
Ms. Dillon.
Mr. Elkouri. Mr. Assassi.
Mr. Assassi.
Mr. Elkouri.
Mr. Elkouri.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Ms. Vandenbelt.
Ms. Vandenbelt.
Mr. Sanson.
Mr. Sanson.
Mr. Serré.
Mr. Serré.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. McDonald Avalon. Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Ms. Hefner.
Ms. Hefner.
Ms. Cedar Brampton South.
Ms. Cedar Brampton South.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mrs. Said.
Mrs. Said.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Madame Mendez.
Madame Mendez.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Ali.
Mr. Ali.
Ms. Bradford.
Ms. Bradford.
Madame Chatel.
Madame Chatel.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
Mr. Meow.
Mr. Meow.
Ms. Taylor Roy.
Ms. Taylor Roy.
Ms. Thompson.
Ms. Thompson.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Simard.
Monsieur Simard.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Monsieur Garon.
Monsieur Garon.
Madame Michaud.
Madame Michaud.
Monsieur Fortin.
Monsieur Fortin.
Monsieur Villemur.
Monsieur Villemur.
Monsieur Thériault.
Monsieur Thériault.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Larouche.
Monsieur Perron.
Monsieur Perron.
Monsieur Barcelou Duval.
Monsieur Barcelou Duval.
Madame Bérubé.
Madame Bérubé.
Monsieur Désilet.
Monsieur Désilet.
La Chambre attendra.
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings.
Je désire informer la Chambre que la période.
I wish to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended.
Si des députés n'ont pas pu voter en raison de.
If members were unable to vote due to technical difficulties, they can use the raise hand function and the chair will recognize them.
Le bureau.
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 135, 135. Nays contre 186, 186.
Je déclare la motion.
I declare the motion defeated.
Sur un appel au règlement.
Rising on a point of order.
I recognize the Honourable House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We just had a very important vote to Canadians, and the member from Avalon literally gave the finger to those Canadians as he stood to vote for our motion, which was to give them a break and a reprieve on home heating costs. He gave the finger to the senior choosing between heating and eating. He gave the finger to all those struggling to make ends meet in an unaffordable Canada. He gave the finger to all Canadians watching.
If I could ask the, getting close to debate, but I see the honourable member rising, I'm assuming in response to this point of order. The honourable member.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I will rise on the same point of order. I scratched the side of my head with 2 fingers. So if they think it's 1 finger, that's up to them. They can take it how they like.
Colleagues, the Honourable Whip from the Opposition.
That it's very unusual to scratch the side of your head with your middle finger as you are voting, and this is the second time I have had to rise in this place when a member from the government party has used that finger motion.
Colleagues. We are now. Colleagues, so I'm going to ask you to both take your seats, please. Please. I'm going to ask both of you to take your seats, please. Colleagues, we had a point of order raising a very serious issue in terms of comportment, decorum, and respect in this House. It was raised by the honourable member. The member to whom it was directed at rose and indicated that this was not done on purpose. I'm placed in a very difficult situation here. If honourable colleagues will allow me to take a look at this issue, but let me just say this. When members are often offered an opportunity to explain their actions, and they do, usually the matter is closed. This has raised some disorder in the House. I will take a look at that, and if necessary, I will come back to the House. But I hope that this will be the end of the points of order on this particular issue. The honourable member from South Shore, St. Margaret's, are you rising on the same point of order?
At a point of clarification or point on.
There is no point of clarification.
As a witness.
So I'm going to ask the honourable member. I just indicated to all members of this House that I'm going to take this issue. I'm going to take a look at the videotape, and I will come back to members if it's necessary. Is North Island Peterborough South, is this on the same point of issue?
The chief whip of our party, you should be given the appropriate time to give the full merit of the situation, as is constitutional.
So I'm going to let members know. I heard the point that was raised by the honourable member. It's a point that is very serious. The honourable member who had concerned rose to offer an explanation. I am going to review the videotape on this and come back to the House if this is necessary. The Honourable Member from Gatineau and Chief Government Whip.
On a different point of order, Mr. Speaker, I would put it to you that during votes, the catcalls and the very oppressive screaming from the other sides is an intimidating and bullying tactic by members of the opposition to all members of this.
So, I'm going to ask. All right. That strikes me as being on the same issue and the same matter, which I have already explained to this House what I'm going to be doing on this. So if there is no related point of order on this, I'm going to suggest that we move on to the business of the House. But I recognize the member, and I hope you heard my statement. I'll recognize a member from Battle Creek,
Grand Prairie.
Sorry, Battle River, Crowfoot.
Grand Prairie, Mackenzie. Or pardon me, Surrey.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, and I think that if you look throughout the standing orders, you see very clearly that it is that when concerns are brought forward in this House, specifically when the Chief Opposition Whip brings forward a concern, Mr. Speaker, that it is absolutely essential and incumbent upon the Chair to ensure that she, in this case, she is heard in its entirety, as the evidence being presented is key to ensuring that we can perform our parliamentary duties in this place. So, Mr. Speaker, to not allow the Chief Opposition Whip to finish her statement regarding something that, whether the governing or other parties like it or not, it is incumbent upon the Chair to ensure that the Chief Opposition Whip has a chance to be heard.
Let me assure all members that I understood very clearly the substance of what was raised and the act that was raised, and I had offered the member who was accused of making that act an opportunity to explain to the House, present his apologies. The member made an explanation. I am going to take this matter back. There is no more reason for us to be able to dispute this matter aside from holding up the affairs of this House. I'm trying to make sure that we conduct this way. But let me reassure all members that I take all of their interventions very carefully, but there is, to this point, I have not heard a new point of order which is being raised. The Honourable member, forgive me, from Grand Prairie, Mackenzie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's important for us to consider what has just happened. In this House, we had a member, the Chief Opposition Whip, that brought forward a very compelling, there's video evidence there, to prove.
So, okay, I'm going, excuse me, all members, I'm going to ask, especially the leadership, I'm going to ask all members, please. Fair enough point from the member from Central Notre Dame, Coastal Bay Central Notre Dame. I'm going to ask the honourable member from Grand Prairie, Mackenzie, to get right to the point so that we can move on with the affairs of the House.
The point is, Mr. Speaker, you have made a great effort in your public comments to state that you want to bring decorum to this House. That is fundamentally undermined in the way in which this whole thing has unraveled. The Chief Opposition Whip was unable to express the evidence that was being put before you. The member from the Liberal Party stood up and said he was innocent while still indicating the gesture that he used. And then, Mr. Speaker, it was only after multiple other interventions before you said that you would take it back. Mr. Speaker, I believe that it undermines the public statements that you've made with regards to bringing decorum to this House.
I cannot. I'm certainly. I'm sorry. I regret that the member feels this way, but I feel, as this chair, is that I heard the point that was raised by the Chief Whip of the Opposition. It was an important point. The point was very well made. I wanted to hear if there are any new points to this. There were no new points which were raised to this. I have asked the honourable member to rise in this House. The member offered his excuse. I had indicated to all members based on what was raised by the Honourable Honourable Whip of the Opposition, that I'm going to take a look at this matter and come back to the House if it is necessary to do so. I'm hoping that the member from Miramichi is rising on an issue, a new point of order. Because if it is on the same one, I think I've heard enough that we should move on to the next item of the House.
Mr. Speaker, it is a new point of order. Myself, many of our colleagues, and many of the people at home continue to ask the same question. Why is the volume being turned down so much by the Speaker? Can you explain why that's happening so often? Thank you.
This was because the chair is standing up, but I'm going to allow the member to. Okay, I'm going to ask the honourable member. So this is the reason why microphones are sometimes turned off, is to preserve the honor of this House when there's conversations which are happening back and forth without people having the floor for that. No one, I can guarantee, no member has ever been cut off in terms of making their presentation, posing a question, or making an answer, with the exception of the time when the Speaker has brought up. This matter has been brought up, and the House leaders and I have talked about this issue, and the issue is being addressed. The honourable member from Miramichi, Grand Lake, on a new matter, I would hope.
A point of clarification on the point of order. Canadians are feeling like their members of Parliament are being subjected to the microphone being turned off right in the point where they're making points of order and points of clarification. That is something that we're entitled to as members of the House. It's happening on this side more often than not. We don't like to be cut off. If it's debate, fine. If you don't agree that it's a point of order, that's fine. But we still have the right to be heard, and the microphone needs to be left on when we're speaking.
On the same point of order, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, and I hope the Parliamentary Secretary will come straight to the point.
Like you, I've been very patient listening to commentaries. You, a while back, very clearly established that you had already received enough information to make some sort of a ruling pending on you taking a review of the situation. Members continue to stand up, which is a challenge of the ruling that you've put as a speaker, Mr. Speaker. I would suggest to you that people just tone down and allow the Speaker to do his job.
So that is not a point of order. I think we finished with all of the matters which are raised right now. I had promised members I will come back to them on the original issue which was raised.
I would like to inform the House that due to the deferred recorded division, government orders will be extended by 12 minutes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I see that there are two members who have their hands up. I see the honourable member from Saanich Gulf Islands.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I'm rising briefly on a point of order because I believe the point of order made by the honourable member from Gatineau may have been missed in the furor over other issues. Being a virtual participant, it's very distressing when during votes there's so much heckling, and that was the point raised. It was not anything to do with anything we observed, anything visual, but auditory interruptions in the voting process are against the standing orders. And I just wanted to rise briefly to support the honourable member from Gatineau, and perhaps you might come back to that question of decorum to remind us of the rules. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I see that there is another honourable member who would like to rise on a point of order. However, I do not see the headset nor a tie on the member. I do know that if the member does have a headset, it would be very helpful, because I'm certain if the member is rising on a point of order, he would like to make sure that the translators can translate his comments. We will come back to that member if that member is able to put on his headset. More than welcome to rise and raise his hand, and the speaker or the chair occupant will recognize that person on a point of order. Oh, the honourable member from Battle River Crowfoot on a new point of order.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, on a new point of order. There is a member of Parliament that was called out the other day for just an absolutely inflammatory tweet. But what's interesting is that further, the member for Fleetwood Port Kells has this habit of not only taking pictures of things that are taking place within this place, but in his Twitter feed is very clearly doing what he calls the fibbometer and tweeting that and calling members liars and talking about untruths in his Twitter feed. So, Mr. Speaker, certainly when a member is in this place, we expect them to abide by the rules of decorum. The member for Fleetwood Port Kells has acknowledged that I believe he used the words, when he puts his elbows up, his guard can come down. So, Mr. Speaker, I would ask that you take a look at the evidence, specifically this member's Twitter feed, and how he is so flagrantly disregarding the rules of order and decorum in this House, and is bringing ultimately disorder. And in this tweet that was posted 7 minutes ago, he is using specifically language that is unparliamentary and, Mr. Speaker, has been doing so from the floor of this place.
I thank the honourable member from Battle River Crowfoot for raising this issue. It's an important issue that the member is raising. However, there are limits to what the Speaker can do. There's enough to do in policing what happens in this place and at committees in terms of the exercise of our parliamentary duties. To be able to monitor all members' social media feeds it is difficult to do that. I do know that it was raised on one issue and invited the honourable member to withdraw his comment. The member was present and did so. The member, I cannot do that right now, but I thank the honourable member for that. This is a good opportunity, once again, to encourage all members to rise to the level that is befitting of the chairs and of the jobs that they hold in this place, to conduct themselves accordingly. And I think that is an important reminder for all of us, so that we can conduct ourselves in a way that we will be proud to have done.
It's important for everyone to behave with dignity that reflects the positions we all occupy here in the House of Commons. I'd like to thank all members for their interventions today.